exactly did you do?
We left off in Guatemala in the spring of 1987. I was working with Peace Brigades International as an escort for the mutual support group of the relatives of the disappeared. What that meant, being an escort, meant that we had people that weren't Guatemalan in the lives and homes, usually, of Guatemalans who were fearful for their lives because of having spoken. I was in Guatemala working with Peace Brigades International, and there was one time that I was sent to escort these two brothers to their small village of Santiago Atitlan. One of their family members had been disappeared. To disappeared means to basically never see them again. Usually you don't know what happens. Sometimes mass graves were uncovered later. Sometimes tortured bodies found. There were prisons filled with people who maybe had just been a union activist or a student or something, or misidentified and disappeared, and it usually meant tortured and killed. While these brothers were going home, they were students at a university in Guatemala City, and they were going home to their village, and I was assigned to escort them for 5 days during the Easter period. Easter is the week when the most disappearances happened each year, or that's what I was told. And the reason for that is because it was a really important holiday in a very Catholic country, Christian country. And so the death squads and the military know they know where to find people on the Easter holiday because they're going to visit their families. So there's also, amongst people who have reason to be scared for whether they're going to live or not, Easter's a heightened period for that. So I went to this little village, and I was filled with so much despair. I saw people with guns bashing this man with the butts of the gun, standing in some ruins. And they saw me standing there, and they turned and pointed a threat towards me. And all I could do was walk away, knowing maybe this person's about to be killed. Like, I was trained as a escort in Toronto, actually, which was where the office was for Peace Brigades International that I worked with. And basically a lot of the training consisted of how to deal with potential violent situations, and our role as international peace activists. We always had to have a camera visible, and our non-Guatemalan looks with our camera was supposed to be our main function as an observer to deter violence, because the ruthless regimes of Guatemala and the death squads were dependent on funding mainly from two places, the United States and Western Europe, and funding through tourism. And the theory was that they didn't want to kill someone from North America or Europe or India who was a peace activist because they didn't want to make a scene. That was the theory of why we would be relatively safe. And more importantly, the theory was that if we're there with a camera documenting it, they don't want to be seen. So that was our role as a deterrent. But I kept seeing really horrible things. One thing I saw was this town, Santiago Atitlan, is on a big lake that is a big tourist lake. Even with war raging, the military was brilliant about how they conducted their war and what they would do. Because it was a civil war and not an official war, they made sure that the tourist industry could thrive to some degree, filled with mainly Western Europeans and North Americans, and carry on attacking their population and ruthlessly through means that the tourists wouldn't know what was going on. And the main groups of tourists that I witnessed in Guatemala were a lot of senior citizens, like what they call the blue hair tours, and a lot of hippies. And there were a lot of hippies who would go to Guatemala, buy indigenous crafts, come back and sell them at Grateful Dead concerts or boutiques or wherever and make a lot of money on it because you could get the stuff really cheap because the US dollar rules or whatever. And so people would take this village of Santiago Atitlan was mainly accessed by most people in the country and most visitors through taking a boat from the village of Panachel, which was the big tourist lakeside resort town. And people would take the boat over in the morning and spend the day in this quaint village buying crafts. The military would be mostly invisible, and then they would take the boat back in the late afternoon, having bought their authentic crafts and seen authentic indigenous Mayan culture. Sutujil was the language of, there's 22, I think, Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala, and they'd hear all these sounds they hadn't heard and get these crafts and eat these foods and go back on the boat. There were no hotels or anything in that town. And they'd go back to the boat, and at night the military came out and did door-to-door sweeps looking for subversives. And I felt like I got to this point by day 5 of being in that village where I just felt I had seen some nasty things. It wasn't my role to go and talk to the tourists, like that wasn't part of why I was there, but it made me really despondent. I was like reading some stupid book by Herman Hesse that I didn't like, but I was craving reading something in English, and that was the only book I could find to take to that town. And I got a tour of the Catholic Church office of the former priest. In this Catholic church, there had been a priest from Oklahoma who had come, and he was preaching liberation theology, and he was murdered in his office for that. And the sisters had left the blood-stained walls and not let that office be used because they loved. He was a very popular priest for trying to, be supportive of poor people, trying to have food and learning to read and write, things that are considered subversive under a totalitarian regime that's there to protect multinational investments and keep the price of coffee and bananas and cotton low. And seeing this blood on the wall, seeing someone get beaten, seeing Protestant missionaries like born-agains trying to convert this kind of weird cross of Catholicism and Mayan practices into their born-again evangelical churches, seeing all this going on, knowing that Reagan supported the Protestant missionaries from the U.S. going down and trying to save the heathens. I just felt so much despair. I get back to Guatemala City, and there was a woman who had lost a number of family members to whatever horror of torture or massacre, and she was asking me how I was doing, and we were trained as escorts. It's not about us. We're not allowed to get involved in people's lives in any way that they don't ask us to. We're not allowed to share our observations. It's really not about us. We're there to serve. And she was asking me how I was doing, and I didn't even know her. I told her that it was hard because I feel a lot of despair, and I was trying to figure out how to be helpful, but didn't know what to do, and was scared of going back to the United States, which I felt like was a country at the root of a fair amount of the misery I was witnessing. And she looked at me and she said to me, "Go back and enjoy your life as much as you can." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "You have the freedoms that I don't have and probably never will have. And the only way these things are going to change is if you live your life to the fullest." And she just kind of looked at me. And she was a very sad person from what she'd been through. And it was really it had quite an impact on me. I came back to the States, and and really tried to take that message to heart. My activism shifted a little bit.